In the kingdom where worth is measured by the strength of one's wolf and the sharpness of one's claws, there exists a special kind of invisibility reserved for those who possess neither. Liane had perfected this art of not being seen, moving through the world like a shadow cast by someone more substantial, her footsteps silent on cobblestones that echoed with the confident stride of those who belonged. She was 17 and utterly forgettable, a poor Omega girl whose parents had died too young, whose wolf had never come, whose very existence seemed to apologize for taking up space in a realm that had no use for the broken. Her entire fortune clinked softly in her palm, one copper coin, worn smooth by desperate hands, and warm with the heat of dreams too small to matter. Around her, the marketplace buzzed with the casual cruelty of commerce, where value was assigned with brutal efficiency and compassion was a luxury none could afford. But at the edge of the square, where shadows gathered thickest and hope went to die, something waited in chains. They called it dangerous, cursed, born wrong. The pup's eyes burned too bright with intelligence that belonged to nightmares rather than nature, and his presence made even hardened warriors step back with instinctive unease. The traders who had captured him whispered of bad omens and darker purposes, demanding payment more to be rid of him than to profit from his sale. 1 coin. That was all they asked for the creature no one else would touch. Liane had spent her life being unwanted, had recognized that particular flavor of rejection in every dismissive glance and cruel whisper. She knew what it meant to be deemed worthless by those who held the power to decide such things. She understood the hollow ache of being forgotten while still breathing, invisible while desperately needing to be seen, and in those burning golden eyes, she saw herself reflected back with devastating clarity. The laughter that followed her purchase was sharp enough to cut, the sound of a pack enjoying the spectacle of stupidity, rewarded with inevitable destruction. An Omega girl and her monster pup. What delicious entertainment they would provide before the inevitable tragic ending. But as Liane walked away with her dangerous acquisition pressed against her heart, she carried within her chest a truth that would reshape kingdoms. Sometimes the most profound acts of rebellion are disguised as simple kindness, and sometimes salvation arrives wearing the face of the thing you're brave enough to love when no one else will. The transformation was about to begin. All it required was 1 coin, and the courage to see worth where the world saw only waste. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The market square of Thornwick buzzed with its usual symphony of commerce and cruelty, where the value of a life could be measured in the weight of copper coins and the sharpness of desperate bargaining. Liane moved through the crowd like a ghost haunting its own funeral, invisible to all save the occasional merchant whose eyes would fix on her threadbare cloak and calculate whether she possessed even the most modest of purchasing power. She had 1 coin, a single copper piece, worn smooth by countless hands and warm from her nervous grip as she surveyed what remained when the worthy customers had taken their pick of the day's offerings. Bruised fruit that would rot by evening, bread hard enough to break teeth, scraps of meat that buzzed with flies and carried the sickly sweet promise of food poisoning. This was what awaited at the bottom of pack hierarchy. The dregs, the refuse, the things deemed unfit for anyone whose life held actual value. "Move along, Omega," growled a merchant, whose stall boasted cuts of meat that made Liane's mouth water with longing. "This is for paying customers." She ducked her head in automatic submission, the gesture as practiced as breathing after 17 years of learning to make herself small in a world that preferred to forget she existed. Her parents had died when she was barely old enough to walk, leaving her to the questionable mercy of a pack that saw orphaned Omegas as burdens rather than children. She had survived on scraps and charity, sleeping in sheds and storage rooms, working whatever jobs the adults were willing to give someone they considered barely above a stray animal. But she had survived. And survival, she had learned, sometimes meant finding value in the things others discarded. The commotion at the far edge of the market caught her attention as she counted her meager coin for the dozenth time. A cluster of people had gathered around what appeared to be a livestock trader's cart, their voices raised in a mixture of fascination and revulsion that drew her like a moth to flame. "Unnatural, that one is," an elderly woman was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Look at those eyes. No proper wolf pup has eyes like that." "Cursed," agreed a man whose fine clothes marked him as prosperous. "Born wrong," Best to put it out of its misery before it grows into whatever twisted thing it's meant to become. Lyanne pushed through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who had spent her life existing in the spaces between other people's attention. What she found made her heart clench with recognition and fury in equal measure. A pup sat chained to the trader's cart with links heavy enough to restrain a full-grown wolf. He couldn't have been more than a few months old, his fur the deep midnight black of expensive bloodlines, his frame already showing the promise of considerable size when mature. But it was his eyes that had drawn the crowd's morbid fascination. Golden orbs that seemed to hold depths no animal should possess, intelligence that felt almost human in its intensity, and pain. So much pain that Lyanne had to look away before it overwhelmed her entirely. "What's wrong with him?" she asked the trader, a grizzled man whose scent carried undertones of too much alcohol and too little conscience. "Nothing wrong that dying won't fix," he replied with a laugh that held no humor. "Found him abandoned on the mountain roads 3 days ago. Been nothing but trouble since. Won't eat, won't sleep, keeps making noises that ain't natural for any pup. Then why not just release him? Because someone might be fool enough to pay for damaged goods." The trader's eyes glittered with the kind of avarice that made Lyanne's skin crawl. "Though I ain't asking much. 1 coin, and whoever's stupid enough to take him can deal with whatever devil's work made him. 1 coin. Exactly what she had." Lyanne looked at the pup again, noting details the crowd had apparently missed in their eagerness to condemn him as unnatural. The way his ribs showed through his thick coat, speaking of recent hunger. The careful way he held his left front paw, suggesting an injury that hadn't healed properly. The resigned defeat in his posture that spoke of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from the world. She recognized that look, had seen it in her own reflection more times than she cared to count. "I'll take him," she said quietly. The words fell into the crowd's chatter like stones into still water, creating ripples of silence that spread outward until every eye was fixed on her with expressions ranging from amusement to outright disbelief. "You?" The trader blinked as if he couldn't quite process what he was hearing. "You want to buy the cursed pup?" "Yes." "For 1 coin?" "Yes." The laughter that erupted from the crowd was exactly what Lyanne had expected, sharp and cruel, and edged with the kind of malicious joy that came from watching someone make a decision that would inevitably lead to their destruction. "This should be entertaining," someone called out. "Omega Girl and her demon pup. Wonder which one will eat the other first." "My money's on the pup," another voice added. "Look at those teeth. Probably tear her throat out before the moon sets." Lyanne ignored them all, focusing instead on counting out her single copper piece with the dignity of someone conducting a transaction of vital importance. The trader snatched the coin with greedy fingers, apparently eager to rid himself of his troublesome cargo regardless of the price. "Pleasure doing business," he said with a grin that revealed more gaps than teeth. "Though I'd sleep with one eye open if I were you, girl. That thing ain't natural, and unnatural things don't stay grateful for long." The chains came off with surprising difficulty, their weight suggesting they were designed to restrain something far more dangerous than a young pup. But when the last link fell away, the pup didn't leap to freedom or attack his liberator. Instead, he simply sat there, those impossible golden eyes fixed on Lyanne's face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Hello," she said softly, extending her hand for him to sniff. "I'm Lyanne. I know you probably don't trust people very much right now, but I promise I'm not going to hurt you." The pup's response was immediate and heartbreaking. He pressed his muzzle against her palm with desperate gentleness, as if her touch was the first kindness he had experienced in his short life. When she carefully lifted him into her arms, noting that he was heavier than his apparent age suggested, he curled against her chest with a sigh that sounded disturbingly human. "There," she murmured, ignoring the continuing laughter and cruel commentary from the dispersing crowd. "That's better, isn't it?" The walk back to her cabin took nearly an hour, following paths that wound through forest thick enough to muffle the sounds of civilization. Lyanne preferred the isolation, the way the trees created walls between herself and a world that had never wanted her. Out here, she could exist without constantly calculating how to make herself smaller, less noticeable, less offensive to those who held power over her life and death. The cabin itself was barely worthy of the name. A single room with walls that leaked in the wind, and a roof that turned every rainstorm into an adventure in creative bucket placement. But it was hers, purchased with 3 years of saved copper pieces, and maintained through stubborn determination to have at least one place in the world where she belonged. "It's not much," she told the pup as she settled him on the single threadbare rug that served as both furniture and decoration. "But it's warm and dry, and nobody can tell us we don't belong here." The pup, she really needed to think of a name for him, explored the space with the careful movements of someone assessing potential threats and escape routes. But when he was satisfied that they were truly alone and safe, he returned to her side with tail wagging tentatively, as if he wasn't quite sure whether such expressions of happiness were permitted. "Are you hungry?" she asked, already moving toward her meager pantry. "I don't have much, but we can share what there is." The meal that followed was sparse by any reasonable standard. A few scraps of dried meat, some stale bread, and water from the stream that ran behind the cabin. But they ate together on the floor, the pup accepting each offered bite with the grave politeness of someone who understood that generosity was precious and should never be taken for granted. "What should I call you?" Liane mused, as she cleaned his wounds with careful hands and warm water. "You're too dignified for something common like Rex or Spot." The pup's response was to fix her with that unnerving golden stare and make a sound that was almost like speech, a low rumble that formed itself into something resembling syllables. "Kale," he seemed to say. Liane blinked, certain she had imagined it. Pups didn't speak, no matter how intelligent they appeared. It was simply her lonely mind playing tricks, creating connections that didn't exist. But when she repeated the name experimentally, "Kyle," his tail wagged with unmistakable enthusiasm. "Kyle it is, then," she said, surprised to find herself smiling for the first time in weeks. "It suits you." As evening deepened into night, they settled together on her single blanket. Kyle curled against her side with the trust of someone who had found safety after a long period of danger. But just as Liane began to drift toward sleep, he started to whimper. The sounds escalated quickly into something approaching panic, not the normal crying of a frightened animal, but something deeper and more complex. Dream speech, if such a thing were possible, fragments of words and emotions that spoke of loss and betrayal, and fears too large for such a small mind to contain. Without thinking, Liane gathered him closer, stroking his fur and humming the lullabies she dimly remembered from her own early childhood. Gradually, his distress faded into peaceful sleep, leaving them both to rest in the quiet sanctuary they had created together. But outside the cabin, something stirred in the forest depths. Ancient instincts awakened by the presence of power that had been thought lost forever. Eyes that glowed in the darkness turned toward the small building where an Omega girl slept beside a pup, whose true nature was about to reshape the very foundations of their world. By morning, word would reach ears that had been listening for exactly this kind of disturbance. By noon, the truth would be known. And by sunset, Liane's quiet life of invisible survival would be shattered beyond any hope of repair. But for now, in the peaceful hours before dawn, she allowed herself to believe that sometimes kindness was its own reward, and that one copper coin had bought her the first real companionship she had known since childhood. She had no way of knowing that it had also purchased her a destiny that would change everything. Liane woke to the sound of wings, not bird wings, but something larger and more purposeful, the rhythmic beat of creatures carrying messages across vast distances with urgent precision. She lay still for a moment, listening to the sound fade into the distance while trying to convince herself it was simply her imagination running wild with possibilities that belonged to stories, rather than her mundane reality. Beside her, Kale stirred with a soft whine that carried undertones of distress. His sleep had been restless throughout the night, punctuated by dreams that seemed too complex for any normal animal, dreams that had left him trembling and calling out in sounds that were almost words. "Shh," she murmured, stroking his fur until he relaxed back into peaceful slumber. "Just birds, that's all. Nothing to worry about." But even as she spoke the words, Liane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through her cabin's imperfect walls. Those had definitely not been ordinary birds. Ravens, perhaps, or something even larger. Creatures that flew with purpose and destination, carrying news that someone considered important enough to send at dawn. She rose carefully, trying not to disturb Kale as she moved to the single window that faced the forest path leading to her cabin. What she saw made her blood run cold. Tracks in the soft earth. Multiple sets, made by boots rather than paws, approaching from the direction of town before circling her cabin like predators sizing up potential prey. They were recent, made sometime during the night while she slept, unaware that her sanctuary had been discovered and assessed by unknown visitors. "Kyle," she whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "We need to go. Now." But even as she spoke, she heard it, the sound of approaching horses, moving at a pace that suggested neither leisure nor uncertainty. Someone was coming, and they knew exactly where to find her. Kale was on his feet instantly, his golden eyes alert and focused with an intensity that belonged to something much older than his apparent age. He moved to position himself between Lyanne and the door, his small body radiating a protectiveness that would have been admirable if it weren't also heartbreaking in its futility. "It's all right," she said, though she wasn't sure whether she was trying to reassure him or herself. "Maybe they're just—" The knock that interrupted her words was not the polite request for attention of a casual visitor. It was the sharp, authoritative demand of someone accustomed to having doors opened immediately and without question. Lyanne's hands trembled as she approached the entrance to her cabin, acutely aware that whatever waited on the other side was about to destroy the fragile peace she had built for herself in this isolated place. But there was no alternative. Running would only delay the inevitable, and hiding was impossible in a space barely large enough for two people. She opened the door. The man who stood on her threshold was magnificent in the way that legends were magnificent, too perfect to be entirely real, too powerful to exist in the same world as ordinary mortals. He was tall enough that he had to look down to meet her eyes, with shoulders broad enough to block out the morning light, and a presence that seemed to make the very air around him vibrate with barely contained energy. His hair was the deep bronze of autumn leaves, his eyes the pale green of sea glass, his features carved with the kind of aristocratic perfection that spoke of bloodlines carefully maintained over generations. He wore traveling clothes that appeared simple, but carried the subtle signs of expensive tailoring. And at his side hung a blade, whose craftsmanship suggested it had never been drawn in anger, because its mere presence was sufficient to end most conflicts before they began. Behind him stood 6 guards whose bearing marked them as elite warriors, men and women who moved with the fluid precision of those trained to kill quickly and efficiently, whose every gesture spoke of absolute loyalty to the figure they protected. This was not a merchant come to collect debts or a neighbor seeking borrowed tools. This was someone whose arrival could reshape kingdoms with a word, whose displeasure could end lives with a glance. This was the Alpha King. Miss Lyanne. His voice carried the kind of authority that bypassed conscious thought to speak directly to the deepest levels of submission that governed pack behavior. "My name is Aldrich Voss. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Behind her legs, Kale pressed closer with a whimper that sounded almost like a plea for protection. But when the Alpha King's gaze shifted to focus on the pup, his expression transformed from neutral politeness into something far more complex. Relief, anger, and a profound sadness that suggested this meeting had been both hoped for and dreaded. "Hello, nephew," he said softly, and Lyanne felt the world tilt on its axis as the implications of that single word crashed over her like a tidal wave. Nephew. The pup she had rescued for 1 copper coin wasn't just some abandoned animal. He was royal blood, family to the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, stolen and left to die before anyone could discover his true identity. And she, poor, unwanted Lyanne who had never mattered to anyone, now stood between a king and his lost heir, bound by a night of shared kindness into a situation that could easily cost her everything she had worked so hard to build. "I can explain," she began, though she wasn't sure what explanation could possibly suffice for the magnitude of what she had apparently stumbled into. "I'm sure you can," the Alpha King replied, his tone carrying undertones that made her Omega instincts scream warnings about dominant predators and the price of challenging their authority. "But first, I think it would be best if you invited us in. What we need to discuss is not meant for curious ears." He was right, of course. Already she could see movement in the forest, other shapes keeping watch, ensuring that this conversation remained private, regardless of how it concluded. The Alpha King traveled with more than 6 guards, apparently, and the others were positioned to guarantee that news of this meeting didn't spread beyond those who needed to know. "Of course," she said, stepping aside to allow them entry. "Please, come in." The cabin, already small, seemed to shrink to dollhouse proportions with the addition of 7 adult shifters, whose combined presence filled every available inch of space. The Alpha King himself dominated the room simply by existing, his authority so absolute that Lyanne found herself instinctively deferring to his preferences before he had even expressed them. "Tea?" she offered automatically, then felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. What could she possibly offer to someone who commanded the resources of an entire kingdom? "That would be kind," he replied gravely, as if her hospitality was genuinely appreciated, rather than pitifully inadequate. As she busied herself with the simple ritual of preparing tea, grateful for any activity that gave her hands something to do, and her mind time to process the impossibility of her situation, Lyanne became aware that Kyle had positioned himself at the Alpha King's feet, with an ease that spoke of familiarity. Not just familiarity, she realized with growing amazement. Affection. The pup was looking up at the most powerful man in the kingdom, with the same trust he had shown her the night before, tail wagging with genuine happiness at this unexpected reunion. "How long has he been with you?" the Alpha King asked, his voice gentler now as he knelt to stroke Kale's fur with hands that trembled slightly. "Since yesterday afternoon," Lyanne replied honestly. "I bought him from a trader at the market. 1 copper piece for what they called a cursed pup. 1 copper piece." The words came out flat, edged with a fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop by several degrees. "They sold the heir to the Northern Crown for the price of stale bread." "I didn't know," she said quickly. "If I had realized, you would have done exactly what you did," he interrupted, and to her surprise, his tone carried approval rather than condemnation. "You saw something in need and chose to help, regardless of the cost to yourself. That speaks well of your character, but it doesn't change the fact that he belongs with his family." The Alpha King's expression grew complicated, shadows passing across his features that spoke of political realities and responsibilities that went far beyond personal preference. "Under normal circumstances, yes, but these are not normal circumstances." "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone wanted my nephew dead badly enough to steal him from his cradle and abandon him in the wilderness to die. Someone close enough to the royal family to know his value and ruthless enough to see a child as an obstacle to be eliminated." His eyes blazed with the kind of controlled rage that could level cities when finally unleashed. "Until I know who that someone is, nowhere in the kingdom is truly safe for him." Lyanne felt ice forming in her stomach as the implications became clear. "You want to leave him here. I want to keep him alive long enough to discover who tried to have him murdered and ensure they can never threaten him again." The Alpha King rose to his full height, his presence filling the cabin like controlled lightning. "Which means, Miss Lyanne, that you have become perhaps the most important person in my kingdom. I don't understand. You're the one who saved him when no one else would. You're the one who showed him kindness when the world had offered only cruelty. And most importantly, you're the one he trusts." He gestured toward Kale, who had indeed moved to lean against her legs as if seeking comfort from her presence. That bond, forged through genuine compassion rather than duty or bloodline, may be the only thing standing between my nephew and another assassination attempt. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of wind through the trees and the distant call of birds whose wings carried messages between distant powers. "What are you asking of me?" Lyanne whispered. "Nothing you haven't already chosen to do," the Alpha King replied. "Care for him, protect him, give him the kind of love that royal protocol often makes impossible." He paused, studying her face with eyes that seemed to see far more than she was comfortable revealing. "In return, you will have the full protection and support of the crown. Whatever you need, whatever resources are required to keep him safe and happy, you need only ask. And if someone discovers the truth, if whoever wanted him dead realizes he's still alive, then they'll have to go through me to reach him," the Alpha King said simply. "And I promise you, Miss Lyanne, that is not a battle they will win." Looking down at Kale, who gazed back at her with those impossible golden eyes full of trust and affection, Lyanne realized that her choice had already been made the moment she placed that copper coin in the trader's palm. She had committed to protecting this pup before she knew his true identity, before she understood the dangers that surrounded him, before she realized that her simple act of kindness would bind her to the fate of kingdoms. But knowing the truth didn't change her heart. "What do I call him?" she asked. "I mean, he must have a real name, a royal name." "Kieran," the Alpha King replied softly. "Prince Kieran of the Northern Crown, son of my sister, heir to powers that won't fully manifest for several more years. And until then, he's Kale, the pup you rescued from the market, who lives quietly with the Omega girl who was kind enough to give him a home." The Alpha King smiled, and the expression transformed his stern features into something almost boyish. Though I suspect that as he grows, maintaining that fiction will become increasingly challenging. As if to emphasize the point, Kale, Prince Kieran, chose that moment to demonstrate abilities that definitely didn't belong to any ordinary pup. He padded over to the cold fireplace and stared at it with focused concentration until flames sprang to life without benefit of kindling or spark. "Yes," the Alpha King said dryly, watching his nephew's casual display of power, increasingly challenging indeed. But as Lyanne watched the impossible fire warm her humble cabin, watched the Alpha King settle on her rough floor as if it were a throne room, watched young Kieran curl up between them with the contentment of someone who had finally found his way home, she realized that challenging didn't necessarily mean unwelcome. She had spent her entire life being nobody special, existing on the margins of a world that barely acknowledged her presence. But sometimes, apparently, being nobody special was exactly what destiny required. One copper coin had bought her more than a rescued pup. It had purchased her a future that would change everything. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The Alpha King departed at sunset, but not before making arrangements that transformed Lyanne's isolated existence into something approaching a fortress disguised as humble simplicity. "Thomas will be your primary contact," he explained, gesturing to one of his guards, a man whose weathered face and gentle eyes marked him as someone who could blend seamlessly into rural communities. Officially, he's a traveling merchant who's taken an interest in this valley's timber resources. Unofficially, he's one of my most trusted operatives and will ensure your safety without drawing unwanted attention. Thomas stepped forward with a slight bow that managed to convey respect, without the formal deference typically shown to royalty. "Miss Lyanne, it'll be my pleasure to serve as your business partner." "Business partner?" "Your new lumber operation," the Alpha King explained with a slight smile. "Congratulations. As of this afternoon, you own exclusive cutting rights to 300 acres of prime forest land, the profits from which should more than cover any expenses related to young Kale's care." Lyanne blinked in astonishment. "But I don't know anything about the lumber business. Thomas does. And the beauty of being a silent partner is that you don't need to know anything beyond how to sign the occasional document and accept the regular payments." The Alpha King's expression grew serious. "More importantly, it gives you a legitimate reason to have visitors, to receive supplies, and to explain any unusual occurrences that might surround a growing pup with royal blood." "What kind of unusual occurrences?" Her question was answered immediately, as Kale, she was still having trouble thinking of him as Prince Kieran, decided to demonstrate another ability by making every metal object in the cabin ring in perfect harmony, creating a crystalline chime that seemed to come from the very air itself. "That kind," the Alpha King said dryly. "Among others, royal bloodlines carry genetic markers that don't manifest until adolescence, but young Kieran appears to be something of an early bloomer." As if summoned by their conversation, Kale padded over to where they stood and fixed his uncle with that unnerving golden stare. But instead of the playful affection he had shown earlier, his expression was now grave, with an intelligence that seemed far too mature for his apparent age. "Uncle," he said clearly, the word formed with precision that made Lyanne's breath catch. The Alpha King went very still. "Kieran, you can speak?" "Some," the pup replied, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated strangely in the small space. "Words come, slowly, but I remember now. Before the bad place, before the chains. What do you remember?" Kale's expression grew distant, as if he was looking at scenes only he could see. Fire in the sky, voices full of anger, someone carrying me away while Mother cried. His eyes refocused on his uncle with heartbreaking clarity. "She tried to protect me, didn't she?" The Alpha King knelt beside his nephew, his composure cracking to reveal depths of pain that had been carefully hidden beneath royal dignity. "Yes, little one. She died trying to protect you. And the person who took me? We don't know yet, but I promise you we will find them." Kale nodded with the grave acceptance of someone far older than his years. Then he turned to Lyanne and pressed against her legs with desperate affection, as if reassuring himself that she was still there, still willing to offer the sanctuary he had found nowhere else. "Lyanne saved me," he announced to his uncle, "when no one else would. She chose me even when they said I was broken." "I know," the Alpha King replied softly. That makes her very special. Will she stay, even now that you're here? The question hung in the air like a challenge, carrying implications that made Lyanne's heart race with possibilities she didn't dare examine too closely. She looked between uncle and nephew, seeing in their faces the complex dynamics of family and duty, and the kind of love that transcended political considerations. That's up to her, the Alpha King said finally. This is her home. These are her choices to make. I'm not going anywhere, Lyanne said firmly, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. If Kale wants me to stay, then I stay. The relief that flooded the young prince's features was answer enough. As the Alpha King's party prepared to depart, he pulled Lyanne aside for a final conversation that would prove prophetic in ways neither of them could anticipate. He's going to grow quickly, he warned, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Royal bloodlines mature at accelerated rates, both physically and mentally. Within a year, he'll have the size and capabilities of an adult wolf, but he'll still be a child emotionally. That combination can be challenging. What should I expect? Power that manifests without warning. Abilities that respond to emotion rather than conscious control. And most importantly, a bond with you that will only strengthen as he develops. The Alpha King's pale green eyes were serious as winter frost. What began as kindness and gratitude will evolve into something deeper, more complex. You need to be prepared for that. Prepared how? By understanding that royal bonds aren't like ordinary attachments. They're forged in fire and blood, tested by time and adversity, and once established, they're nearly impossible to break. He paused, studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? That depth of connection? Lyanne looked through the cabin's window at Kale, who was entertaining the departing guards by making flowers bloom out of season with focused concentration. The display of power should have frightened her, but instead, it filled her with fierce protectiveness and something deeper, pride in his abilities, joy in his obvious happiness, and a growing certainty that she would do whatever was necessary to ensure his continued safety. Yes, she said simply, I think I am. The Alpha King smiled, and for a moment, his stern features resembled his nephew's, when the young prince was particularly pleased about something. Good, because I suspect you're going to need every ounce of that determination in the months ahead. After they were gone, silence settled over the valley like a blanket, broken only by the sound of wind through trees and the distant call of night birds beginning their evening songs. Lyanne and Kale sat together on her front step, sharing the simple meal she had prepared while watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Are you sorry? Kyle asked suddenly, his voice carrying the careful uncertainty of someone who had learned to fear rejection. Sorry for what? That your quiet life is over. That everything is different now. He looked up at her with eyes that held depths of ancient wisdom despite his youthful appearance. You didn't ask for any of this. You just wanted to help a hurt pup. Lyanne considered the question seriously, thinking about the life she had lived before yesterday. Solitary, peaceful, safe in its insignificance. Then she thought about the alternative, returning to that existence while knowing that somewhere in the world, a lost prince was suffering without anyone to care for him. No, she said finally. I'm not sorry. Are you? Sorry for what? That you're not growing up in a palace with servants and tutors and all the things a prince should have. She gestured around at her humble cabin, with its rough walls and simple furnishings. This isn't exactly the royal treatment you deserve. Kale's response was immediate and fervent. This is better than a palace. This is home. How can you be sure? Because in a palace, I would be Prince Kieran, heir to the Northern Crown, future ruler of territories I've never seen filled with people I don't know. He pressed closer to her side, seeking the comfort that had become as necessary to him as breathing. Here, I'm Kyle. You're Kyle, the pup you chose when no one else would. The simple truth of his words settled around them like a benediction, confirming what Lyanne had suspected but hadn't dared voice, that sometimes the most profound transformations began not with grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, but with quiet choices made from the heart. You're Kyle, she repeated softly, testing the words and finding them perfect. Always, he promised, and in his voice she heard the absolute conviction that would someday make him a king worth following. They settled into new routines over the following days, learning to navigate the complexities of their transformed relationship. Kale's abilities continued to manifest in unexpected ways. Flowers bloomed when he was happy, Small objects moved according to his will, and his understanding of human speech developed at a rate that suggested royal bloodlines carried more than just political significance. But it was the emotional bond between them that proved most remarkable. As the Alpha King had predicted, the connection forged through kindness and mutual choice deepened with each passing day, becoming something that transcended normal relationships between human and shifter. They shared dreams sometimes, experienced each other's emotions with startling clarity, and developed an almost telepathic awareness of each other's needs and desires. Thomas proved to be an invaluable ally, arriving every few days with supplies, news from the outside world, and quiet reassurance that the Alpha King's protection remained absolute. He also brought updates on the investigation into Kale's kidnapping, progress that remained frustratingly slow despite the resources being devoted to uncovering the truth. Whoever orchestrated this was very careful, he explained during one of his visits, speaking in the kind of coded language that had become second nature to them all. The trail leads in multiple directions, suggesting either a very sophisticated conspiracy or deliberate misdirection designed to confuse our efforts. Any suspects? Lyanne asked while watching Kale practice his emerging abilities by encouraging a small sapling to grow at an accelerated rate. Several, but none with clear motives or obvious opportunities. Thomas's expression grew grim, which suggests the threat may be closer to the royal family than anyone wants to admit. The implications of his words sent a chill through Lyanne that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. If Kale's enemies were indeed among those closest to the throne, then even the Alpha King's protection might not be sufficient to ensure his safety indefinitely. But as she watched the young prince coax flowers into bloom with the pure joy of someone discovering magic for the first time, she felt her resolve strengthen rather than waver. Whatever threats emerged from the shadows of court politics, whatever enemies revealed themselves through patience and investigation, she would be ready. Kyle had chosen to trust her with his life and his heart. She would prove worthy of both, no matter the cost. The first real test of their new circumstances came 3 weeks after the Alpha King's visit, announced by the sound of approaching hoofbeats and the kind of official formality that preceded unwelcome news. Lyanne was teaching Kale to read, a process complicated by his rapid intellectual development and his tendency to make the text glow when he became excited about a particular passage. When Thomas arrived with an expression that immediately put her on alert. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Official inspectors are coming to survey the lumber operation. They'll be here within the hour." "Is that unusual?" Lyanne asked, though Kyle's sudden tension suggested he understood the implications better than she did. "Very. Especially since they're coming from the capital rather than the regional office, and they specifically requested to meet with the property owner." Thomas's jaw was tight with concern. "Someone is taking an interest in your business affairs, and that suggests they're also taking an interest in you." "Could be coincidence," Lyanne said hopefully. "Could be," Thomas agreed in a tone that suggested he didn't believe it for a moment. "But we can't afford to take chances. Kale needs to be somewhere else during their visit." "Where?" "The old root cellar behind the cabin. It's reinforced and soundproofed. A relic from when this land was used for storing contraband during the border conflicts 20 years ago." He was already moving as he spoke, gathering supplies and making preparations with the efficiency of someone who had planned for exactly this contingency. "He can wait there safely while we handle the inspection." But when they approached Kale with the plan, his reaction was immediate and vehement. "No," he said firmly, his golden eyes blazing with distress. "I won't hide while strangers threaten Lyanne." "They're not threatening me," she said gently, kneeling to his level. "They're just doing their jobs, checking on the business." "You don't understand." Kale's voice carried harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate with urgency. "I can smell their intentions. These aren't officials conducting routine business. These are hunters." Thomas went very still. "Hunters? People who seek things that don't want to be found. People who hurt others to get what they want." Kale pressed against Lyanne's legs with desperate protectiveness. "They know something. Not everything, but enough to be dangerous." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by voices that carried the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Whatever the truth of their visitors' intentions, there was no time left for debate or alternative planning. "The cellar," Thomas said firmly. "Now. I won't leave Lyanne alone with them." "You're not leaving me," Lyanne said quickly, understanding sparking in her mind. "You're protecting me. If they are hunting for something specific, and they find you here, it puts us both in danger. But if you're hidden and safe, then I can handle whatever questions they ask without worrying about your safety." Kale's expression showed that he understood the logic, even as he hated the necessity. "You'll call for me if you need help?" "I promise." "And you won't let them hurt you?" "I promise that too." With obvious reluctance, Kale allowed Thomas to lead him to the concealed entrance of the root cellar, a space that had indeed been designed to hide valuable things from prying eyes. But just before he disappeared into the underground chamber, he turned back to Lyanne with an expression that was far too mature for his apparent age. "If something happens to you," he said quietly, "I will make them regret it for the rest of their very short lives." The words should have sounded like childish bravado. Instead, they carried the kind of absolute certainty that made Lyanne believe he possessed exactly the power necessary to fulfill such a promise. "Nothing will happen," she assured him. "I'll be right here when you come back up." The official party that emerged from the forest consisted of 5 riders, whose bearing marked them as more than simple bureaucrats. They wore the uniforms of royal inspectors, but they moved with the controlled precision of trained fighters, and their eyes held the kind of sharp awareness that spoke of people accustomed to finding hidden things. Their leader was a woman whose silver hair was pulled into a severe bun, and whose pale eyes seemed to catalog every detail of Lyanne's appearance with uncomfortable intensity. When she dismounted, her movements carried the fluid grace of someone who could transition from bureaucratic politeness to lethal violence without changing expression. "Miss Lyanne?" she asked, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone born to authority. "I'm Inspector Valdris from the Royal Commercial Office. We're here to conduct a routine assessment of your lumber operation." "Of course," Lyanne replied, grateful that her voice remained steady, despite the fear racing through her veins. "Though I should mention that I'm essentially a silent partner. Thomas handles all the operational details." "Thomas?" "My business partner," Thomas said, stepping forward with the kind of confident professionalism that belonged to someone who had nothing to hide. "I manage the day-to-day operations while Miss Lyanne provides the local knowledge and community connections." Inspector Valdris studied them both with eyes that missed nothing. "I see. And how long have you two been working together?" "About a month now," Lyanne said honestly. "It's been quite profitable so far." "I'm sure it has." The inspector's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mind if we take a look around? Standard procedure, you understand." What followed was the most nerve-wracking hour of Lyanne's life. The inspectors moved through her property with the systematic thoroughness of people who knew exactly what they were looking for, examining every building, every piece of equipment, every corner where something might be concealed. They found nothing suspicious in the cabin itself, though Inspector Valdris lingered over Kale's food bowl with an expression that suggested she found its presence noteworthy. "You have a dog?" she asked casually. "A young wolf pup, actually," Lyanne replied, sticking as close to the truth as possible. "I rescued him from the market a few weeks ago. He's probably out exploring the forest right now. He likes to hunt during the day." "A wolf pup." The inspector's voice carried subtle undertones that made Lyanne's skin crawl. "How interesting. They're not usually kept as pets. This one was abandoned, half-starved when I found him. I couldn't just leave him to die." "Of course not. How very compassionate of you." Inspector Valdris made a note on the paper she carried, her movements precise and somehow threatening. "What breed would you say he is?" "I'm not sure," Lyanne lied smoothly. "He was in poor condition when I got him. Thomas thinks he might be part northern mountain wolf, based on his coloring." "Northern mountain wolves are quite rare," one of the other inspectors observed. "Valuable bloodlines, if properly documented." "I wouldn't know about that," Lyanne said, with what she hoped was convincing ignorance. "I just saw an animal that needed help." The conversation continued in the same vein for several more minutes, with questions that seemed designed to trip her up or reveal inconsistencies in her story. But Thomas proved to be an invaluable ally, providing detailed information about their fictional lumber operation with the kind of expertise that made their cover story completely credible. Eventually, Inspector Valdris seemed satisfied that they had learned everything they could from a surface examination. But as her party prepared to depart, she delivered a warning that sent ice through Lyanne's veins. "Miss Lyanne, a word of advice," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested failure to heed her counsel would be unwise. "This is a dangerous region for someone living alone. Wild animals, bandits, all sorts of threats to an unprotected woman. I can take care of myself. I'm sure you believe that. But if you were to acquire anything valuable, you might want to consider whether keeping it here is truly in your best interests. The inspector's pale eyes were cold as winter frost. Sometimes the wisest course is to contact the proper authorities and let them handle dangerous situations. I'll keep that in mind, Lyanne managed to say. See that you do. After they were gone, Lyanne waited nearly 30 minutes before signaling for Kyle to emerge from his hiding place. When he finally appeared, his expression was dark with fury that seemed far too intense for someone his apparent age. They know, he said without preamble. Not everything, but enough. They know something valuable is hidden in this area, and they suspect you're involved. How can you be sure? I could smell their intentions even from underground. They came here hunting, and they left convinced they're on the right trail. His golden eyes blazed with protective rage. They'll be back, Lyanne. And next time they won't bother with the pretense of official business. Thomas nodded grimly. He's right. That wasn't a routine inspection. It was reconnaissance. They were mapping our defenses and looking for weaknesses they could exploit in a future operation. What do? We prepare for war, Kyle said simply. And in his voice, Lyanne heard echoes of the king he would someday become. Powerful, determined, and absolutely ruthless when protecting those he loved. As they began planning for the confrontation that now seemed inevitable, Lyanne reflected on how completely her life had changed since that day in the market. She had bought what she thought was a damaged pup for 1 copper coin. Instead, she had purchased a destiny that would require her to become someone stronger, braver, and more dangerous than she had ever imagined possible. The transformation was just beginning. The attack came at the new moon, when darkness offered perfect cover for those who preferred their violence conducted away from witnessing eyes. Lyanne woke to the sound of Kale's warning growl, low and deadly, unlike any noise she had ever heard from him before. In the 3 days since Inspector Valdris's visit, he had grown again, his size now approaching that of an adolescent wolf despite his actual age. But it was the power radiating from him that truly marked the change, an aura of controlled menace that made the air itself seem electric with potential violence. They're here, he said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that bypassed her conscious mind, to speak directly to instincts older than civilization. 12 of them, moving through the forest like they own it. Lyanne was already reaching for the emergency beacon Thomas had given her, a crystal that would summon royal guards if activated, when Kale's paw pressed gently against her hand. No time, he explained. They're jamming magical communications. Uncle's forces won't receive the signal until it's too late. Then we run. Where? His golden eyes blazed with intelligence far beyond his apparent years. They've surrounded us, Lyanne. This isn't a scouting party or a probe. This is a full assault designed to capture or eliminate everything in this valley. Through the cabin's single window, she caught glimpses of movement in the forest, dark shapes flowing between trees with military precision. These weren't bandits or opportunistic raiders. These were professional soldiers operating under orders that came from someone with serious resources and dangerous intentions. What do they want? She whispered. Me, Kyle replied simply. But they won't hurt you to get me. I won't allow it. Kyle, you're still just a pup. You can't fight 12 trained soldiers. His response was to let his true nature show for the first time since the Alpha King's visit. Power erupted from him like controlled lightning, causing every metal object in the cabin to resonate with harmonic frequencies that spoke of abilities barely held in check. His eyes blazed with inner fire, and when he smiled, Lyanne saw teeth that belonged to something far more dangerous than any ordinary wolf. I'm not just a pup anymore, he said, his voice carrying depths of authority that made her Omega instincts respond with involuntary submission. And they're about to learn exactly what it means to threaten someone under my protection. The first wave of attackers reached the cabin as Kyle finished speaking, their approach announced by the sound of breaking glass, as smoke grenades crashed through the windows. But instead of creating the confusion they were designed to cause, the weapons seemed to trigger something primal in the young prince. He moved, not with the clumsy enthusiasm of a child, but with the liquid precision of a predator whose bloodline had been perfected over centuries of careful breeding. The cabin door exploded outward as he burst through it, and the sounds that followed spoke of violence, conducted with such efficiency that it was over almost before Lyanne could process what was happening. When the smoke cleared, 6 attackers lay unconscious in her front yard, their weapons scattered, and their armor torn by claws that could apparently manifest at will. Kyle stood in the center of the destruction, barely breathing hard, his golden eyes scanning for additional threats, with the focused intensity of someone who had discovered his true nature and found it magnificent. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made disobedience literally impossible. "The others are regrouping, but they'll think twice before rushing in again." "Kale, this is insane. You're just—" "I'm Prince Kieran of the Northern Crown," he interrupted, and for the first time since she had known him, he spoke those words with the full weight of their meaning. "I carry the blood of the first kings, the genetic legacy of rulers who commanded not just armies, but the very forces of nature itself. And right now, that legacy is the only thing standing between you and people who would hurt you to get to me." Through the shattered windows, Lyanne could see the remaining attackers taking cover at the edge of the clearing, their confidence clearly shaken by the ease with which their companions had been defeated. But they weren't retreating. If anything, they seemed to be preparing for a more coordinated assault. "They have silver weapons," Kale observed, his enhanced senses apparently able to detect details that escaped normal perception. Bullets, blades, even nets designed to contain supernatural creatures. Someone provided them with very specific intelligence about what they might face here. Inspector Valdris? Possible. But I suspect she was just the advanced scout for someone with deeper resources and more serious intentions. His expression grew grim. "Whoever orchestrated my kidnapping as an infant is making their move again. But you're safe now. Your uncle knows where you are. Thomas checks on us regularly. And yet here we are, surrounded by enemies who knew exactly where to find us, and exactly what they were hunting." Kale's voice carried a bitterness that belonged to someone far older than his apparent age. "Someone close to the crown is feeding information to our enemies, Lyanne. Someone my uncle trusts implicitly has been planning this for months." The truth of his words settled over her like ice water, bringing with it the realization that their sanctuary had always been an illusion. No matter how carefully they had hidden, no matter what protections the Alpha King had arranged, there had always been eyes watching and ears listening from within the very heart of royal security. "What do we do?" she asked. "We disappear," he said simply. "Not just from this valley, but from the official knowledge of anyone connected to the crown. We become ghosts, existing in the spaces between official awareness until I'm old enough and strong enough to reclaim what's mine. And then," Kyle's smile was sharp as winter wind, carrying promises of retribution that would be both patient and absolute. "Then I remind certain people what it means to threaten the Northern Crown. But first, we need to survive the next few hours." The coordinated assault came just after midnight, launched with military precision and overwhelming force. But the attackers had made one critical error in their planning. They had assumed they were facing a normal child under the protection of an ordinary Omega. What they encountered instead was a young prince whose royal heritage was finally awakening to its full potential, defending someone whose safety mattered more to him than his own life. The battle that followed would become the stuff of legends in years to come, though the official records would list it as nothing more than a bandit attack that was successfully repelled by royal forces. But those who witnessed it firsthand would never forget the sight of a wolf pup, barely old enough to be weaned, calling down lightning from clear skies and commanding the very earth to rise up in defense of his chosen home. When the last attacker fell, some dead, others unconscious, all thoroughly convinced that they had underestimated their target by several orders of magnitude, Cal stood in the ruins of what had once been Lyanne's peaceful cabin, his fur matted with blood that wasn't his own, and his eyes blazing with power that seemed drawn from sources beyond mortal understanding. "It's time to go," he said, his voice carrying exhaustion and grim satisfaction in equal measure. "This place is compromised, and staying here will only invite more attacks." Lyanne looked around at the destruction, her home reduced to splinters and smoke, her carefully built sanctuary transformed into a battlefield, and felt something break in her chest that had nothing to do with material loss. "Where can we go that will be safer than this?" "Nowhere that exists on any official map," Kale replied, padding over to where she stood and pressing against her legs with the same affectionate trust he had shown since their first night together. "But the world is larger than most people realize, Lyanne. There are places where old magic still runs strong, where those who seek refuge can find it if they know the right paths. You're talking about the deep wildlands, places like where your uncle sent us to meet with the Forest Lady." I'm talking about places where my bloodline still carries weight, where the ancient compact between the royal houses and the forces of nature still holds meaning. His golden eyes reflected moonlight that seemed to come from within rather than without. Places where a lost prince, and the woman who saved him, can disappear until it's time to reclaim what was stolen. As they gathered what few possessions had survived the attack, Thomas emerged from the forest, where he had been conducting his own battle against attackers who had tried to flank their position. His clothes were torn and bloodied, but his expression carried the grim satisfaction of someone who had defended what mattered and found the cost acceptable. "Your Highness," he said formally, offering Cale the kind of bow that recognized royal authority, regardless of current circumstances. "My apologies for not arriving sooner. They had watchers positioned to intercept any reinforcements." "You came when it mattered," Cale replied with the gracious acceptance of someone born to command. "Are any of them alive for questioning?" "3, though they're not talking yet." Thomas's expression grew dark. "Professionals. All of them. The kind who don't break easily under normal interrogation. Then we'll have to hope that Uncle's specialists are more persuasive than usual." Cale turned to study the forest around their destroyed sanctuary, his senses apparently detecting things that escaped normal perception. How long before more arrive? Hard to say, but this operation was too well planned to be a one-shot attempt. Whoever ordered this will have contingencies in place. Thomas paused, studying the young prince with obvious concern. "Your Highness, with respect, where exactly are you planning to take Miss Lyanne? The safe houses we've established are all known to the crown, and therefore potentially compromised." "Into the deep places," Cale said simply, "where royal blood opens doors that remain closed to ordinary wolves, and where ancient oaths still bind the powers that shape this realm." "The Shadowlands?" Thomas's voice carried a note of alarm. "Your Highness, those territories haven't been visited by our kind for generations. We don't know what still lives there, what rules still apply. We know that enemies who depend on conventional resources can't follow us there," Cale replied firmly. "And we know that my bloodline carries obligations and privileges that transcend the political maneuvering of the current age. It's a risk, but a calculated one. And if the ancient powers refuse to recognize your claim, if the Shadowlands reject you as they have every other visitor for the past century." Cale's smile carried confidence that seemed drawn from sources beyond his apparent years. "Then Lyanne and I will make our own sanctuary, forge our own alliances, and build our own power base from whatever resources we can gather. But I don't think that will be necessary." "How can you be so sure?" "Because the Shadowlands have been waiting for exactly this situation, a legitimate heir seeking refuge from corruption within his own bloodline." The young prince's eyes blazed with certainty that bordered on prophecy. "They've been preparing for our arrival far longer than we've been planning to make it." As they prepared to depart the valley that had been home for such a brief but transformative time, Lyanne found herself looking back at the ruins of her cabin with complex emotions. She had lost everything again: safety, comfort, the illusion of a normal life lived in peaceful obscurity. But walking beside her was a young prince, whose potential seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, whose loyalty to her had been proven in blood and fire, whose destiny was becoming increasingly impossible to deny or ignore. "Are you ready?" Cale asked, using the same words that had marked so many turning points in their relationship. "I've been ready since the day I spent my last copper coin on a dangerous pup," she replied, echoing her own response from what seemed like a lifetime ago. Together, they disappeared into the deep forest, following paths that existed only for those who carried the right bloodlines and understood the proper words of passage. Behind them, royal forces would eventually arrive to investigate the attack and secure the area, but they would find only empty ruins and mysteries that would frustrate investigators for years to come. The lost prince and the Omega who had chosen to save him had vanished into legends that most people no longer believed existed, and in the hidden places of the world, powers that had slumbered for generations began to stir with anticipation. The true heir was coming home at last. 6 months later, the Shadowlands welcomed them with the kind of enthusiastic hospitality that suggested they had indeed been expected for far longer than seemed possible. Lyanne stood on a balcony carved from living stone, looking out over a realm that existed in the spaces between official maps and government surveys. Below her stretched forests that grew according to rules older than human civilization, their canopies shifting between autumn and spring, according to the moods of powers that found seasonal consistency boring. In the distance, she could see the spires of what Cale had explained was the archive, a repository of knowledge that had been collecting information about the supernatural world since before the first kings learned to organize their territories into coherent kingdoms. And everywhere, the sense of being home in ways that transcended geography or politics. "You're adapting well," observed a voice from behind her, warm with approval and ancient wisdom. Lyanne turned to find Lady Morrigan approaching with the fluid grace that marked all the inhabitants of the Shadowlands. She was tall and elegant, with silver hair that moved in breezes that touched nothing else, and eyes that held depths of forest green shot through with veins of gold. "I have excellent teachers," Lyanne replied, gesturing toward the training grounds where Kale was working with instructors who understood royal bloodlines in ways that normal tutors never could. He had grown again during their journey to the Shadowlands, his size now approaching that of a full adult wolf despite his actual age. But it was the changes in his bearing that truly marked his development, the confidence that came from understanding his true nature, the authority that flowed from accepting his heritage, and the power that manifested when he stopped trying to hide what he was becoming. "He's magnificent," Lady Morrigan observed, following her gaze. "Everything the prophecies suggested and more. But then, royal bloodlines always exceed expectations when they're properly nurtured." "Prophecies? Oh yes. The archive contains quite detailed predictions about the lost prince, who would come to the Shadowlands seeking refuge and leave as something far more dangerous to the established order." The lady's smile was mysterious as moonlight, though I must admit, most of the prophecies focused on him, rather than on you. I'm just the Omega who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Are you? Lady Morrigan's eyes sparkled with amusement. Or are you exactly what he needed to become, who he was always meant to be? Before Lyanne could ask what she meant, Kale appeared on the balcony with the silent grace that had become second nature to him. His training in the Shadowlands had awakened abilities that went far beyond normal royal heritage, and his presence now carried an authority that made even ancient powers treat him with respectful deference. "Ladies," he said formally, offering bows that managed to convey respect without subservience. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Never," Lyanne replied automatically, then felt her cheeks warm as both Kale and Lady Morrigan smiled at the obvious affection in her voice. "Actually," Lady Morrigan said with obvious amusement, "your timing is perfect. I was just about to explain to Lyanne why the prophecies were so interested in her role in recent events." "Which prophecies?" Kale asked, moving to stand beside Lyanne with the protective instincts that had become as natural as breathing. "The ones that predicted the return of the true royal bonds," Lady Morrigan replied seriously. "The connections between rulers and their perfect complements that made the ancient kingdoms so much stronger than anything we've seen in modern times." "I don't understand," Lyanne said, though something in her chest was beginning to flutter with possibilities she didn't dare examine too closely. "The first kings didn't rule alone," Lady Morrigan explained patiently. "They ruled as bonded pairs, two individuals whose strengths and weaknesses balanced so perfectly that together they transcended the limitations that bound either one separately. But as political marriages replaced chosen bonds, as duty superseded genuine connection, that power was lost. Until now," Kale said softly, his golden eyes fixed on Lyanne's face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Until now," Lady Morrigan agreed with satisfaction. "The bond between you two isn't just affection or gratitude, though it certainly includes both. It's the kind of connection that made kingdoms legendary and rulers into forces of nature themselves." "What does that mean, practically speaking?" Lyanne asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It means that when Kale reclaims his birthright, and he will reclaim it, he won't be ruling alone," Lady Morrigan said with certainty. "It means the Northern Crown will once again be worn by a bonded pair, whose combined power will reshape the very foundations of how supernatural society understands leadership and authority." "A queen," Lyanne whispered, the word feeling both impossible and inevitable on her tongue. "Not just a queen," Kale corrected gently, moving closer until she could feel the warmth radiating from his presence. "My queen, the other half of my soul, the perfect complement to everything I am, and everything I hope to become." Through the windows of the archive, sunlight caught and held in patterns that spoke of ancient magic, awakening to acknowledge what was occurring on the balcony. Around them, the Shadowlands themselves seemed to sigh with satisfaction, as if destiny was finally clicking into place after years of uncertainty. "Are you ready?" Kale asked, using the question that had marked every turning point in their relationship. But this time, Lyanne understood that he was asking about more than just their next adventure. He was asking if she was prepared to transform from a poor Omega girl into someone capable of standing beside him, as he reclaimed not just a throne, but the very concept of what true kingship should represent. "I've been ready since the day I spent 1 copper coin on a pup, whose eyes held too much intelligence for any ordinary animal," she replied, echoing the response that had brought them to this moment. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate hunger of someone who had finally found his other half, the fierce joy of recognition, finally acknowledged. And around them, the Shadowlands blazed with power that spoke of ancient compacts fulfilled and greater destinies about to unfold. They had begun as a lonely Omega and a lost prince. They would return to the world as something the political establishment had never seen before and was completely unprepared to handle. A bonded pair whose love for each other was matched only by their determination to build a kingdom worthy of the sacrifices required to create it. The transformation was complete. Now the real work could begin. 2 years later, the coronation of the true Alpha King was conducted not in the traditional throne room of the capital, but in the great amphitheater of the Shadowlands, where representatives from every supernatural community in the known world had gathered to witness the beginning of a new age. Queen Lyanne stood beside her mate as he accepted the crown that was his by right of blood and birthright, but she wore her own diadem, a circlet of living silver that had been crafted by powers older than recorded history, to mark the first true royal bond forged in over 3 centuries. In the audience, she could see faces that had become familiar during their time in the Shadowlands. Lady Morrigan and the other guardians who had taught them to understand and channel their combined abilities. Thomas, who now served as their primary liaison with the conventional world, and in the places of honor, representatives from the various factions that had chosen to support their claim, rather than the puppet rulers who had been installed after Kale's supposed death. But it was the empty seats that truly marked the magnitude of what they were undertaking. The nobles who had orchestrated Kyle's kidnapping and attempted assassination had been exposed during the investigation that followed their disappearance from the mortal world, their conspiracy unraveled by evidence that the Archive's researchers had spent months carefully assembling. Some had fled to distant territories where they hoped to escape justice. Others had chosen to fight rather than face trial, meeting ends that were swift but not particularly merciful. And a few, the wisest among them, had accepted the new reality and pledged their loyalty to rulers who understood that true strength came from service rather than domination. "Do you, Kieran of the Northern Crown, accept the responsibilities and burdens of true kingship?" asked the ancient voice that spoke from depths of shadow and starlight. "I do," Kale replied, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the very foundations of the amphitheater. "Not for personal glory or political advantage, but for the welfare of all who seek justice and protection under my rule. And do you, Lyanne of the Chosen Heart, accept the responsibilities and burdens of true queenship?" "I do," she said firmly, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Not for personal advancement or material gain, but for the promise that power exists to protect those who have none, and that love freely given can transform any kingdom into something worthy of legend." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything recorded in conventional history. Instead of simple political theater, it became a working of magic that bound them not just to each other, but to the very forces that shaped their realm. When the ancient powers spoke their names and accepted their oaths, reality itself seemed to shift in acknowledgement of new authorities that transcended ordinary political structures. And when it was over, when the last words of binding had been spoken, and the final ceremonial gestures completed, King Kieran and Queen Lyanne stood before their assembled subjects as something unprecedented in the modern world. Rulers whose authority came not from inherited privilege or military conquest, but from the recognition that they were exactly what their people needed them to be. "Your Majesties," called out a voice from the audience, a young Omega girl whose presence marked one of the many changes they had already begun implementing. "What happens now?" Kieran smiled, the expression transforming his stern features into something approachable and warm. "Now we go to work. We build the kingdom we've promised. We protect the people we've sworn to serve, and we prove that sometimes the best leaders are those who understand what it means to be powerless. And if the old powers resist, if they try to undermine what we're building here, Then they'll learn why the ancient kings were remembered not for their mercy, but for their absolute determination to protect what they held dear, Lyanne replied, her voice carrying depths of resolve that surprised even her. As the celebration continued around them, as representatives from a dozen different supernatural communities mingled and planned and began forging the alliances that would support their new government, Kieran and Lyanne found a quiet moment together on a balcony that looked out over the Shadowlands they had learned to call home. "Any regrets?" he asked, using the question that had become traditional between them. "About which part?" she replied with amusement. "Spending my last coin on a dangerous pup? Following you into the wildlands? Accepting a crown I never asked for? All of it. Everything that brought us here." Lyanne looked out over the realm they would now rule together, at the impossible beauty of forests that grew according to their own laws, and the distant mountains where dragons still nested in caves, lined with crystals that sang in harmony with the wind. Then she looked at Kieran, her mate, her king, her perfect complement in all the ways that mattered. "Not one," she said finally. "Though I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen differently. If I'd walked past that trader's cart, if I'd saved my coin for something practical instead of spending it on an act of compassion, then someone else would have saved me," Kieran said with absolute confidence. "Because destiny doesn't depend on any single choice or any single person. It depends on the eternal truth that love freely given will always find a way to triumph over fear and hatred, even when the odds seem impossible. Especially then." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her with the same protective instincts that had first drawn them together. After all, what could be more impossible than a poor Omega girl becoming the queen of the supernatural world's most powerful kingdom? "When you put it like that," Lyanne said with a laugh, "I suppose anything is possible." In the distance, the archive's spires caught the last light of evening, their crystalline surfaces reflecting possibilities that stretched into futures yet to be written. And somewhere in those towers of accumulated knowledge, scholars were already recording the first day of a new age, one that would be remembered not for conquest or domination, but for the revolutionary idea that the greatest power of all was the choice to love without condition or limitation. A single copper coin had purchased more than a rescued pup. It had bought a transformation that would echo through the generations, proving that sometimes the most profound changes in the world begin with the smallest acts of kindness. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.